Okay, thank you, Heather, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. Thanks for thanks for being here. Thank you for taking some time out of your evening to be here. I'm going to take up for consideration a few stories, a couple stories, and a couple other teachings from early Buddhism, and then relate these to some of our own practices in our Zazen practice primarily. So I'm going to begin with a story that was, as far as I know, was a story that was taken up, perhaps for all we know, it was a story that was even generated, that he was even created by early Chan Buddhists in China. And as you may know, Chan Buddhists are really the forerunners to our own form of Zen Buddhism that we practice in the Chosei Zen line. And they relate a story from near the end of the life of the Buddha, where he is determining who is going to lead the Sangha, who is going to lead the Buddhist community after the Buddha passes on. And so he gives a sermon called the Flower Sermon. And it's mostly known not because of the flower, although I'll give some attention to that later. But it's mostly known because it's a wordless sermon. It's a sermon with no words. What happens is he assembles together his disciples, and everyone knows that the Buddha is of an age where his body is fragile, and he has told people that he is close to identifying, to determining who will continue on the tradition, who will be called what's called the first patriarch, at least according to the Chan tradition, following in the footsteps of the Buddha. But he says no words. He simply holds up a white flower. And one amongst them smiles. And his name is Mahakashyapa. Mahakashyapa. No one understands the meaning of the sermon, except, according to the story, Mahakashyapa. And from this really simple interaction, the Buddha gives a direct transmission of wisdom to Mahakashyapa. And he bestows upon him the title of the first patriarch. And so towards the end of the sermon, it reads, "The subtle Dharma gate," Dharma as in the teachings of the Buddha, "the subtle Dharma gate that does not rest on words or letters, but is a special transmission outside of the scriptures. This the Buddha entrusts to Mahakashyapa." So what is the meaning of this teaching moment, of the Buddha doing something so ordinary as holding up a flower and not saying a word? And what are the criteria upon which the Buddha determines that Mahakashyapa is worthy of carrying on the tradition? Zen and Chan Buddhists typically answer these questions by celebrating and emphasizing how profound a moment this is, because something was transmitted with no words, right? So beyond words and scriptures. And that through this, the Buddha conveys the nature of suchness. In Sanskrit, tatata. In Japanese, sonomama. It's a term that we've heard often if you've been around Zen teachings, right? And it's translated sometimes as suchness, or things are just so. The suchness in the sense of it's just such. For example, a flower is just a flower. It's just so. It just does what a flower does. Things are just as they are. And it's often taken to mean that there is a certain ineffable nature, something that transcends words and concepts that words and concepts cannot capture. But there's something really interesting and almost ironic about this, and that is that, of course, the teachings of the Buddha are given in words and scriptures. And not just this, but Zen Buddhists in particular, this is something that maybe sometimes doesn't get noticed so often, even amongst our group of people who are training in our form of Zen, is that Zen Buddhists represent a very small minority in Japan. And not just currently, but historically, Zen Buddhist communities have represented a very small minority amongst Buddhists who have trained and assembled into communities in Japan. And yet, sorry, there's someone, I'm not sure if you can hear some hammering upstairs. So, yeah, they're trying to get into this party, but they didn't register. But in any case, what is ironic is that Zen Buddhists, we celebrate the truth that is beyond words and scriptures, and yet Zen Buddhists have written far more literature, far more commentarial literature on Buddhist teachings, even Taoist teachings as well, than any other school in amongst the Buddhist schools in Japan. So there's a really interesting contradiction there. And I don't think it's enough just to say words and meanings, these things are silly, or you think too much. There's a lot to that. For sure, I have heard this an awful lot in the history of my, in the years of my training. But anyway, I highlight this for two reasons. One is that Zen is not really anti-intellectual at the heart of things. They use words and letters, but they use it to build a bridge, right? Or to point to something, but not to stop at the pointer, right? To direct you to the moon, so to speak, but not to stop at the finger that's pointing to the moon, right? So it's to build a bridge between our ordinary experience and then this realization of suchness. A second point, I think, is that teachings such as those of the Flower Sermon are rather cryptic or vague, and I think they're deliberately cryptic or vague. And the reason is because I think it invites our own interpretation. It invites our own interpretation so that we can find meanings that resonate with us, that resonate with our own times, our own cultures, and for sure, our own bodies. How do these teachings resonate in our own bodies, with our own experience of our own bodies? So it's in the spirit of this that we'll walk through some exploration of some ideas that are connected to this Flower Sermon and some other teachings that we're very familiar with, both in theory and also in practice. So I'll first move from this teaching of the Flower Sermon, which comes at the end of the Buddha's life, to some teachings that come to the very beginning of the Buddha's career as the Buddha. The Buddha's first teachings when he comes out of his enlightenment experience are called the Four Noble Truths. These Four Noble Truths, and he presents them much like a doctor who is trying to diagnose a problem in his patients, his suffering patients, and then to offer a solution. And so he goes about, what's the cause? What's the diagnosis? They're suffering. 2, what is the cause? It's craving and ignorance. I'll say something about craving a little bit later. 3, how do we bring about, or what is the solution? The solution is the cessation of the cause of suffering. And then 4, what's the path to realize this sensation? But above all, this is really an inquiry into this thing that the Buddha calls dukkha. Dukkha, Sanskrit term, very close to the Pali dukkha. And it translates as suffering. And I'll spend some time here exploring some of the resonances here between dukkha and suffering. But I want to begin by emphasizing that the first noble truth is sarvam idam dukkham, which means all this is suffering. It's a radical claim, but everything is suffering. He's very clear about this. He only uses 3 words, and it's explicit. All of this that you see, hear, touch, think, this is this stuff called dukkha. And he elaborates, he goes into this by saying there are 3 forms of dukkha, and each one becomes more and more subtle. The first one he calls ordinary suffering, Dukaduka, and it includes simple things like you step on a needle, you hurt your toe, you break a nail, you're in Zazen, and the jiki won't ring the bell, and your knee is hurting an awful lot, right? This is Dukaduka. But what's interesting about this is this ordinary suffering, it presupposes a number of dualities, and these dualities characterize ordinary life. Pleasure and pain, these are opposites with ordinary suffering. Not so with the deeper layers of suffering. Subject and object, right? I am suffering, but you are not suffering. Or I'm the jiki, my body feels fine. Yours might not, right? This is ordinary suffering, subject-object duality. Of course, I'm sure you have a good jiki, and your jiki does feel you're suffering, right? But you may not believe that in those moments. And then there's suffering in time. I'm suffering now, but this will be over, and I'm gonna get off the cushion, and man, my legs feel great. So as long as I don't get back on that cushion, there ain't no suffering now, right? Of course, it's not so simple, right? But this is ordinary suffering. And the Buddha wants to kind of break through these dualities by exploring the deeper layers of meaning of suffering. That when we explore these meanings of suffering, certainly in the Zen tradition, we will break through these dualities. This is much of the rationale. So what does the Buddha mean when he says all of this is suffering, and how do we break into this? Certainly it contradicts, or it seems to contradict, our ordinary understanding of suffering. So let's take two things into consideration. One is, we give the Buddha the benefit of the doubt, right? We wouldn't be here if we didn't already give him the benefit of the doubt, that he knows what he's talking about, or at least we think he knows what he's talking about. That's one. But if you're going to take that, you got to go with number two, which is there's something he knows about suffering that I don't, that I haven't figured out yet. That's why I'm in this, right? That's why I'm doing this and involved in this, in these activities that really sometimes do involve enhanced ordinary suffering. So instead of asking, is this true? Is what the Buddha is saying is true? Which we can't really answer until we get to his standpoint and until we get to his perspective. It would be more productive to say, how is this true? How can it be that what the Buddha is saying is true? But of course, these truths are offered in cryptic ways, in vague ways. So we need to go about exploring how these things are true through our own experiences. So, to that end, Heather, hopefully I'll get this right. I'm going to start by showing some images here. There we go. All right. Can you see this here?
Jeff, it's very small and we can see the document in the background.
Okay. Okay, I think I know what we did.
Yeah, that looks like what we practiced.
This works. Okay. Is it big enough to see? Okay. Now, is it blocked? Are you still able to see it?
This looks perfect.
Okay, great, great. Now, this you all know Van Gogh, but this is one of his maybe lesser known paintings. It's called Wives Carrying Sacks of Coal. And I bring this up because in this painting, Van Gogh is exploring the meaning of suffering. Now, we know this from some commentary on some of his work. So I'll just throw this out there for you, and you can write this in the box, and I'll figure out how to read this in the box. But let's start with this. It's an open question, so please just write your first response to this. What do you see in this painting, or what do you feel in looking at this painting? What's your first response to that? Yeah, do check this out. I'm sure most of you probably are already. But heaviness, physical weight, heavy burden, imbalance. Cynthia writes, pain and injustice. Yeah, very interesting. So here we find a group of women, and as most of you point out, most of you who wrote in the chat box at least, but it's fairly obvious, we have a group of women who are heavily burdened down by heavy bags of coal. They're hunched over, right? Some at almost 90 degrees, and they're walking along a very barren, snow-covered path. They're also depicted as passive, right? They are depicted or portrayed as powerless victims, right? Victims of injustice. They are made to undergo overbearing work conditions. Even if you look at the woman here in the lower left, right? She's kind of looking back here. She's looking back here, and of course, even the background itself is kind of ominous, but she almost seems to be expressing a kind of world weariness, a definite sense of dis-ease, and a real physical dis-ease that is expressing something, at least it feels to many of us, much deeper. In short, the painting conveys the heavy weight of suffering. To suffer is to endure something physical or mental or spiritual. It's to endure a heavy weight. And it's to be oftentimes forced to continue on without much choice. Suffering feels like an assault against our agency, against our autonomy. And interestingly, this is evident in the word itself, in the word suffering itself. The word suffering comes from the Latin term subferre. So we got two parts here, subferre. Sub, like submarine, right? Under or below or beneath. Also means secondary, subordinate, right? And then ferre, F-E-R-R-E, as you see here, meaning to carry or to bear or to endure. Just like if you get on a ferry to move between locations, right? A transport ship, the ferry rides beneath you. In some sense, it's a sub-ferry, right? It rides beneath you, it carries your weight. So quite literally, to suffer means to be made to undergo, to endure, to be subjected to being underneath a burden, or something that you have to carry, or something you have to bear. Right? This is the most direct, literal meaning of suffering, and we see it very much so, I think, in this painting. Now, it's often said that suffering is a limited translation for dukkha, but I've never seen that claim made by scholars when they consider these earlier meanings that have been lost through the time of, just the meaning of the word suffering. If you look at the term dukkha, dukkha is comprised of two parts: dukh, the first part, and ka. Dukh is fairly easy. Dukh means difficult, as you can see here, or bad. Actually, it initially comes as dus, and then through just Sanskrit combinations of consonants and sounds, it becomes dukh in this case. And the most prevailing interpretation of the meaning of dukkha is having a bad axle, as if you're riding on a cart and one of its wheels has a broken off-centered hole, and so the cart it's not going to be a smooth ride. So you're going to have some suffering along the way. This is a common interpretation of dukkha and how it could mean having a bad axle. But I don't find that to be particularly interesting. But there's another interesting interpretation of the term. It's not as common, but it's very plausible. And there's some very highly regarded language scholars, Sanskrit and Pali language scholars, that have voiced this interpretation. And they say that the ka, the second part, this derives from this Sanskrit root verb sta. And here's why. If you just look at the written script, can you see my cursor? Okay, this is very similar to how you write ka. You've got these two parts. The difference is that this middle line here gets eliminated. So the sta, they think, in time just gives way to ka, as for whatever reason, this got written as this, and then just simply became pronounced as dukkha instead of dus sta. But the thinking is that dukkha, originally meaning dusta, meant nothing to do with a cart or a bad axle. It meant basically difficult to stand, or standing badly, or an improper manner of standing. In short, bad posture. This is one interpretation of the original meaning of dukkha, as bad posture. Now, interestingly, if we interpret Van Gogh's painting through this lens, right, we can see very clearly that these women are having a very difficult time standing beneath the burden of this heavy weight of sacks of coal. Suffering is a direct manifestation of being beneath a heavy burden. Now, there's an early parable from the Buddha. It's really a wonderful parable, and it would seem to support this interpretation. And here, as I just said, the Buddha would seem to have some sense of the relationship between the experience of weight and also suffering. This is called the parable of the raft, and he often speaks in parable in order to relate kind of some of the subtle meanings of particularly the noble truths. So I'll just read it out here for you, and you can read along. This is the Buddha speaking the whole time. He says, "O monks, a man is on a journey. He comes to a vast stretch of water. On this side the shore is dangerous, but on the other side it is safe and without danger. There is no bridge for crossing over. It would be good, therefore, if I would gather grass and wood, branches and leaves and make a raft, and with the help of the raft cross over safely. Having crossed over and got to the other side, suppose that man should think, 'This raft was of great help to me. It would be good if I carry this raft on my head or on my back wherever I go.' What do you think, O monks? If he acted in this way, would that man be acting properly with regard to the raft?" The Buddha answers his own question. "No, it would be good if I beached this raft on the shore or moored it and left it afloat. In the same manner, O monks, I have taught a doctrine, the Dharma, similar to a raft. It is for crossing over, but it is not for carrying." So, the meanings of this, some layers of meaning of this are fairly obvious, but just to point them out, we have two shores, right? On this side is the shore of suffering. It's the shore where we experience life as if there is a weight that bears down upon us. And the goal of Buddhism, implied by this parable and other teachings of the Buddha, is to get to the other side. The other side is nirvana, where the causes of suffering, the causes of dukkha, the causes of those things that make us feel like we're just getting by, we're gritting and bearing it beneath the heavy burden, these causes are absent. These causes have been extinguished, and therefore there's no dukkha, there's no suffering. This parable illustrates the Buddha's pragmatic attitude. He calls for a particular attitude towards dukkha, and it's very practical. Just let it drop. Whatever it is that you're carrying with you, just let it drop. In fact, he's so intent upon letting things drop that he says, don't just let go of things that are bad for you. Let go of even my own teachings, which presumably have done some good for you. Let go of even these teachings, because even the Dharma can become a heavy weight. It can be something that pulls you down into clinging and attachment. It can be a cause of suffering, of standing beneath a heavy burden. So letting go is a mental poise, and it's a poise that we're supposed to develop in order to address this problem of suffering, in order to get from out beneath the weight of the burdens of life. But there's an unspoken assumption here. To be under what one carries, to subfere, the literal meaning of subfere, to be under what one carries, this is bad. And to not be under what one carries, this is good. This is the other shore. But is it not possible to be under what one carries without exhibiting suffering, or without exhibiting dukkha, bad posture? Is it necessarily the case that the weight of things entails standing badly? Consider this woman here. She stands beneath a weight, shows no signs of suffering. This woman here, presumably walking a long distance, she even exhibits a certain ease, a certain grace. This woman here, right, she's got quite a heavy load, no indication of being weighed down. This woman here, she's just showing off. In fact, she's having fun. This woman here, she's putting her child clearly at risk. Right? She enjoys suffering and she likes to involve her children in it. Very bizarre, right? This woman, clearly a masochist, perfect for Zen training. She enjoys being under a burden and staying there. And then there's these three women. They love being under the weight of things. Right? Now, of course, none of these depictions show a suffering being. They don't show a body that's depressed. They don't show a body that's caved in or overburdened by life. But clearly there is a weight. They're standing directly beneath it. These women receive weight. They allow gravity to drop into their bodies. But they are not passive victims in the face of it. Instead of exhibiting suffering, they actually show a real poise, a physical poise of lightness. And there's certainly a levity here. Many of them are smiling. There's a real vitality, and you can see it very clearly on their faces. Ironically, these three women here are carrying 3 baskets. And if you know any of the history of early Buddhism, there's a collection of texts called the Pali Canon. And the Pali Canon is often called the Tripitaka, the 3 baskets. Tri for 3 and Pitaka is a basket. The Vinaya gives you the rules for monastic life. The Sutras, which are supposedly the original teachings of the Buddha, the original sermons of the Buddha. And then a collection of really interesting but very dense texts called Abhidharma, which gives us a very precise analysis of mental phenomena, emotional phenomena. It's very closely related to practices of meditation that the Buddha advocates. Most likely, actually not most likely, in all likelihood, these women were not able to study the Tripitaka as in the Pali Canon. Right? Men were traditionally taught the 3 baskets of the Pali Canon, and women were tasked with carrying ordinary baskets. Right? But might these baskets, the ordinary baskets, might they have taught these women something about suffering? And what about the rest of us? Might we, in our case, have lost something because we don't carry baskets? Now, anthropologists tell us that it was quite common for Westerners to carry baskets on their heads up until around the Industrial Revolution. Then what happened? We developed motorized carts. We developed corresponding skills like how to drive cars, how to fix cars. Nowadays we have laptops. We don't need to carry baskets anymore. This allows us to glide over a landscape. We can get between places quickly. But in the process of doing this, did we forget more than just how to carry baskets? Did we forget how to stand beneath the weight of things? Did we forget how to subfere, how to suffer? Now, for some clues to this, let's consider a few contrasts. I'm going to focus on 3 contrasts between Theravada Buddhism. Theravada is traditional Buddhism where the Pali Canon is studied very, very thoroughly, and our own Zen Buddhism. This is by no means a way of asserting the superiority of one tradition over the other. It's just a way of clarifying by way of contrast. As related in the parable of the raft, the Buddha seems to have some understanding of the relationship between suffering and weight. We should get beneath the weight of things, get out from beneath the weight of things in order to end suffering, in order to break free from suffering. And he emphasizes a number of very sophisticated, very advanced mental meditations. Mindfulness meditation, concentration methods. You've heard of Vipassana, I'm sure. Metta, a kind of loving kindness meditation. If you've practiced these, I'm sure you've experienced at some point, if not consistently, these are really fantastic methods to kind of ease yourself of the burdens of life. Mental, emotional. He did this to develop mental poise and to open ourselves, to open the heart, to open the mind. However, he does not appear to have developed a way of training the body in order to face suffering. These were by and large mental practices. And we can see this here with these 2 monks. The Theravada monk, a little bit slumped over, his eyes are closed. It's not that he's doing a bad job, it's just these are simply not things that are emphasized in many Theravada meditation styles. Zazen, by contrast, as you know, this is not how we sit. And you can see this here. This guy here has very straight posture. There's a sense of groundedness. His spine is straight. He's growing tall through the crown of the head. He looks relaxed for the most part, but there's a certain intensity that you might feel. Now, in Zazen, let's just clarify a couple basic things that some of you are familiar with, some of you may not be. But we could say there's 3 basic or elementary guidelines to sitting Zazen. First, we'll start with posture. And there's 3 basic or elementary guidelines to posture. And this is given here in the slide. You want to draw on the chin. You want to maintain a natural spine posture. But by natural, we don't mean just your the posture that you go to when you're comfortable or slouching. That is not actually, from a Zen perspective, a natural posture. What is meant by natural is actually a posture where you can align yourself with gravity such that minimal effort is required to keep yourself upright. And when you are slumped over, you're engaging a lot of musculature that doesn't need to be working. Right? Even if your head is tilting over a little bit, you know this if you work on a laptop a lot. You have pain in the shoulders, upper mid-back, the neck. That is not a natural posture because the whole time you are fighting gravity. Right? So a natural spine. And a third thing is you want to find your energetic center of gravity in what's called the tanden or the hara. Tanden in the Chinese tradition emphasize an awful lot in Taoist practices such as Tai Chi or hara in Japanese. This is the energetic core of our psychophysical being. And it stabilizes the erect, nice and tall, but very relaxed body, such that pressure and tension and contact with the external world, but also your thoughts, gets registered and absorbed in the lower belly. Second principle is breath. You've heard a lot about this, I'm sure. Hara breathing. Breath is very important in the Theravada practices. Right? You observe the inhalation at the nose, how it comes out the nose, for example. But hara breathing is not explicitly a part, certainly, of Theravada practices. With the inhalation, let's start with this. What happens is, of course, as many of you know, you allow the belly to fill with air, the lower belly to fill with air. And it's a slight balance between pushing the air down, but it's more of a drawing the air down, allowing it to get pulled in, dropping below the chest and shoulders. As the lower belly fills with air, you're scanning the body. You're looking for points of tension or holding patterns, places where you're stuck. You might feel this around the eyes, around the jaw, the shoulders. You gently make structural adjustments throughout, particularly on the inhalation phase as things are relaxing. In many ways, this is very much a yielding or a letting be attitude in the inhalation phase. You're simply allowing the breath to enter, the body softens. And in so doing, little by little, the breath gradually sinks down closer to the pelvic floor, and it widens outward in time. With the exhalation, now the exhalation is given much more emphasis, and your exhalation should be longer than your inhalation. I'm sure, again, many of you heard this, right? There's emphasis on a long, very steady, very controlled and calm, complete out-breath, such that every bit of air gets exhaled, right? With the exhalation, you're driving the breath into the hara and down into the pelvic floor. You're contracting the anus. You're slightly tucking the tips forward in order to create an unimpeded channel. And you can see this here. This channel that tunnels down into the hara, into the pelvic floor, right? And then extends tall through the spine. A subtle collecting together, a gathering together of subtle energy called ki or chi or even ki collects in the hara and it slowly extends upward. While all the while the physical body, the gross physical body, relax, the shoulders just kind of drop off the spine, while a subtle body becomes very vibrant and grows tall. We can think of a number of useful examples. There's really excellent ones out there. I'll just take up for consideration two of them. This is one here. If you consider the workings of a reciprocating engine or a piston engine, what we have is a heat engine that uses one or more reciprocating pistons to convert pressure into energy through a rotating motion. Okay, so this will push down, this piston here, and then this thing will start to rotate. It will churn a little bit. What's happening is we have this fixed cylinder and a moving piston. And what happens is there's an expansion, there's an expanding combustion of gases, right? Pushing the piston downwards in this circular motion, and it creates an ignition that generates power, and this power gets moved up a vertical channel. Now, bring this up because in some ways, this is analogous to what's happening with the force of the exhalation. You're pushing the heat of the exhalation down, right? Down into the lower belly. It circulates air. At the same time, you're maintaining pressure at the front of the belly, but also through all sides of that lower belly. And what happens, of course, as I've already indicated, right, and as many of you know, right, this heat extends upwards, permeates the body, and it even, you can feel it, right, in a very subtle way. It pours out into the room, right? An intense but soft power develops in the lower belly. And it's for this reason, interestingly, that actually the lower belly, in Sanskrit, the term is garbha, and I don't know the Chinese for this, but the same term that's used in Buddhist texts, also yogic texts. Ellen, I wonder if you could speak to this. But in Taoist texts as well, the same term for belly is womb. Womb and belly. Even men have this womb. But of course, it's a womb for this supple, dynamic, subtle energy. It's a subtle life. Here's a second example. If you read, hopefully it's not too small, if you read some of these points in these bubbles, These are all instructions on how to stand with the basket on your head. How to stand beneath the weight of a basket. These are almost the exact same principles of posture that we use in Zen. And it's no surprise that these women have mastered the first principle of Zazen Posture. And what's involved here? A very sharp sensitivity to gravity. Everything aligns and it drops right into the belly. And you can see this one here. Shoulders and arms back. Where's the one? Head loads require deep muscle strength. Right? In other words, things drop right into the belly, while the upper torso, the shoulders, very relaxed. And you can see this in the face. The face is very relaxed. Things just drop naturally. To give a little clarity to this, and in particular to give a little more clarity to the relationship between Zazen and the problem of suffering, let's just take some consideration of some linguistic relationships here. The following English words are derived from a common Latin ancestor, and that ancestor is, as you can read here, gravis, meaning heavy or weighty. Gravity, gravy, granum, gravel, grief, grievance. The link between gravity and gravy, grain, gravel is probably not much of a stretch, right? Gravity refers to this weight of downward acceleration. Gravy is a heavy sauce, a stew, comes to us by way of granum, meaning seed or grain. Gravel, coming from the Old French gravelle, meaning sand or small stones, rocks. All of these terms, gravy, grains, gravel, these things are heavy. They settle into small cracks. They're very susceptible to gravity. There's a recognition of this in the early language. What's less apparent is the link between gravity and grief. Have you ever considered how much does grief weigh? It might seem like a really silly question, since we can't put grief on a scale, right? But we all know some thoughts and feelings are heavier than others. For example, which one is heavier? Joy or grief? Love or loss? Life or death? Let's just take 30 seconds here. What comes to mind here to these questions? 1, you can write in the chat box. How much does grief weigh? Answer this any way you like. Quantitatively in terms of pounds, qualitatively in terms of poetry, in comparison with joy. How much does grief weigh? Question 2, just write in whenever you like. Where does grief begin? Where does it first manifest? Specifically in the body. Where do you first feel grief in the body? And 3, where do you carry your grief? So how much does grief weigh? Where does grief begin? And where do you carry your grief? Interesting. I'm sure you're reading some of these, right? A lot of upper body, I'm noticing. Lungs, heart, chest, head. Right? Olga writes, pretty heavy. It's a ton. Grief weighs a ton. In the chest, but expands the whole body. There's many ways to respond to these questions, but I think something worth considering is that grief shares a very close kinship with aggravation. It shares this kinship by way of the term gravare, which means to weigh down, and aggravare. You can see some of these terms at the bottom here, which means to add to the weighing down, to add to the sense of oppressiveness, to increase to this. So one feels aggravated, let's say, when one has a grievance. And when one has a grievance, one often gets angry. Things are getting worse. There is an add to the gravare, an aggravation. The grief gets worse. It snowballs. And what happens when you get aggravated? We have words like hot-headed, right? For people who are in the grip of anger and aggravation, heat rises. One's face might even turn red, right? When one becomes aggravated. But grief, interestingly, well, we might feel it up here or even here, right? Certainly it shows in the face, right? But it occurs, or it seems to register, at least in many cases, a little lower, right? At least in the heart and the mid-chest area, like many of you mentioned. And we have phrases for this. And some of you pointed to this: a heavy heart. I'm feeling down when we're grieving. I have a heartache. So the heart, right, has a lot to do with grief. It would seem that we carry grief and aggravation in the heart and the head, respectively. But now, while we hold or carry grief and aggravation in these areas, is this really where grief begins? Is this really where grief first manifests? Aggravation typically begins with grief, it would seem. I first have a grievance, I'm grieving something, and then quite often I get aggravated, right? Depending on your personality, of course, where you tend towards. But oftentimes that's how it goes. And it might seem like grief tends to rise. It elevates in the body when left to its own devices. Let grief go and it becomes grievance. But this may not actually be the design of grief itself. Grief is a part of this cluster of gravis terms, and they all mean heavy. Grief has this sense of getting us down. And there's a lot to suggest, even in the language, that it occurs further down in the heart than the heart. So for example, someone says, my stomach is all tied up in knots. Right? I feel sick to my stomach upon hearing of a loss. What happens is this sensation often gets forgotten or disregarded or misplaced. Maybe it's too uncomfortable, or maybe because we think we can fix this. I gotta fix this feeling. It's uncomfortable. Or I'm gonna fix the cause, right? Someone maybe did something uncomfortable, made me suffer, I'm gonna fix you. Right? We often think this way. The Buddha, he understands this somewhat in this sense. Don't get overwhelmed by this here. I'm really concerned mostly with this area, this section here. Sensation gives way to craving, gives way to clinging. If you know much of early Buddhism or some Vipassana, maybe you've heard some of this. The Buddha identifies craving as a principal cause of suffering. And why? Because craving binds our present actions to the felt need to rectify or overcome or escape past grievances. You feel grief, and we have a craving to do something about it, right? This in many ways is what aggravation is. The felt need to fix that which causes our grief. Right? But by disciplining this felt need to react to sensations, the Buddha says, you can drive a wedge between the sensation and the craving, and in time, the aggravation will subside. The craving and what fuels the craving will subside, right? And you experience the grief without the aggravation arising, right? You're no longer compelled then to carry the grief. Craving, like aggravation, is a mechanism, it's a way of carrying the grief. That's why at the end of the parable of the raft, right? He says, you monks who understand the teaching as similar to a raft, give up even good things and give up evil things, right? Give up the aggravation. Just let the grief be. Stop trying to fix it. Now, from this perspective, it gives a really interesting perspective. The problem is not that grief happens. And also in Zen, there's a recognition the problem is not that grief happens, because there's a recognition that we cannot eliminate all of the conditions that can give rise to grief and grievances. We all have reasons in life every day to have a grievance. Instead, the problem is, certainly for Zen, but also for the Buddha, how we carry our grief. Since in carrying our grief, we all too easily cling to our grief, and then attachments form. And so you can see this here. There's a grief, there's a craving, and then there's a clinging, there's an attachment. And you are now carrying your grief. This is the problem, the Buddha says. It's the carrying. It's not the fact that there's grief. There's an important distinction between the Buddha's mindfulness-based approach to the arising of grief and that of Zen training. And that is, in Zen training, we don't focus so much on giving a description of what it's like to experience grief or what it's like to carry grief. We focus more so on practically experimenting with practices of how to carry grief and how to carry grief in the body. Where we feel grief largely hinges upon where we hold our grief. If you're holding your grief in the throat, you're going to feel the grief in the throat. If you feel the grief in the temples, if you're holding it in the temples, I'm trying to figure it out, you're going to feel it there. And if you're holding it in the heart, you're going to feel it in the heart. But grief first manifests in the gut, right? And due to the craving, again, to rectify things, it rises. And we compulsively hold on to these grievances, and we hold them in our shoulders, in the jaw, sometimes in our fists as an aggravation. But grief is like heartburn in some sense. It backs up, right? It rises up. But again, this may not be the design of grief itself. It may actually result from the rising up, results from our felt need to do something about it, our obsessive need to do something about our grief, the inability to just sense, to just face our grief. So Gordon Green, whom you all know, a Zen priest and Roshi in the Chosei Zen tradition, he writes of this experience of grief. Right? I was with my mother when she died, and I can still feel in my body the sensation of just sitting silently at her bedside for the 30 minutes before my sister arrived in the room. I felt drained of all thought. Every part of me sagged, felt pulled toward the floor. Gravity and grief as one. Grief is not unlike gravy and grains and gravel. It's meant to sink, but it often doesn't sink because we hold on to it. And we don't just hold on to it because of psychological things going on. We hold on to it because of distortions and misalignments in the body with respect to gravity. So how do we let the grief drop? Green Roshi explains, and this is part of Zen, our Zen training, it's a physical ability. It's a capacity also that can be trained. So he attributes much of his own success in this respect to having developed hara. But this requires an immense amount of physical labor. He writes again, in order for that dropping of grief to happen, numerous muscles throughout the body need to wake up and to relax. For muscle tissue to wake up, it needs to feel the pull of gravity. But this awakening to the work of gravity throughout the body takes a great deal of time because of the ways in which we identify with our habits, that is, with our attachments. One kind of habit is neuromuscular. And due to these neuromuscular habits, we are largely unaware of the ways in which we hold our body in the gravitational field. This means that literally, we don't feel gravity in the majority of the muscles in our bodies. At least, we don't feel that gravity until we are struck by grief or we train intensely in Zen. Green Roshi echoes traditional Buddhist teachings, but he says there is a way out of this cycle of habituated suffering, and a way that does not require us to ignore the body, where craving has made a home. When done right, grief is a quick path to developing a soft and supple, fluid body. A body where, like gravel, grief and other sensations can sink. But the body should not fall like a wet noodle, right? The Zen body does not sag beneath weight. In feeding the lower belly, right? In stoking this tender, soft, and supple ki or ki, the belly becomes pregnant with animating life force. And it's no small coincidence, I think, that another of these gravis terms is gravid, pregnant. This brings us back to the meaning of dukkha as standing poorly. The end of suffering comes when your posture, at least from a Zen perspective, when your posture becomes good. And the key to this is the exhalation. If the inhalation involves that feeling of weightiness, that feeling of abandoning to the weight, the exhalation drives this countering lift down and then upwards, and it stokes and intensifies this subtle energy. Again, that lifts upwards, it powers upwards and supports the body that is feeling the weight of things at the very same time. The body comes into proper alignment with its gravity, and the weight just drops through. It drops to the ground without being held by the muscles in between. So this will be the last bit here again. And this is related to what gravity can teach us for facing the suffering of others. There's a critique of the parable of the raft, and it has to do with the bodhisattva. And the critique is this, that when you get to the other side, the bodhisattva says, you have to go back. You have to pick up the raft, and you have to go back. It is not enough just to put the raft down. And gravity plays a key role here. And of course, the bodhisattva ideal, a very core teaching in our Zen training. And here we find this, I think, in this term gravitas, likewise derived from gravis. Gravitas, something like dignity or influence, solemnity, depth of personality, and weight. It's a poise, but we shouldn't psychologize the poise. It's physical. It has to do with how a person of gravitas pulls others into their field. It pulls them into their weight, into their mass. And yet it has a quality that elicits out of others, not a loss of agency, but an awakening of agency, an awakening of relaxation in their own bodies, a sense of respect, trust, safety. It viscerally registers in the body as calm, ease, a sense of groundedness. So this last quote here, Gordon here, reflecting on his experiences as a hospital chaplain. He says, if you learn to sit Zazen, your senses become more open. For many people whose work it is to alleviate the suffering of others, whether physical or emotional or spiritual, one of the toughest skills is to learn how to face that suffering without it becoming a burden of your own. If I become bent over with the weight of the other's burden, then all of my experience as a hospital chaplain suggests that I won't be of much help. Whatever words might be spoken with the other person, I would also want to show them what's possible in my own body. I can teach them what it means to let the weight of that load flow through me as efficiently as possible. In many ways, this is the working of gravitas, or the working of gravity, which leads to a body that exudes gravitas. A final comment here, returning to the flower sermon that we began with. I wonder if we can find some resonance centering around the experience of weight in this parable and also in much of our Zen training. We might say that all things are suffering insofar as all things have weight. And all things have not just their own weight, they all stand beneath the weight of others. We all stand beneath the weight of others. We feel the weight of our neighbors, of our loved ones, particularly during these times. Gravitas, something that one develops either naturally or through discipline training in Zen or some other form of discipline. Gravitas enables us to skillfully use that weight. You don't just grin and bear the suffering or the weight beneath which you are. You use that weight to develop the ability to more clearly affirm life. You develop this very supple, pregnant belly. And in the process, you're affirming life, and you're feeling the smallest, lightest, most fragile things, a flower. Knowing the suchness of things may begin here, just feeling the weight of things, just as they are. So we can end there and went a little bit over here, but we have some time for questions.
Jeff, do you mind unsharing your screen so we can see if there's anyone who has any questions, and I'll try to facilitate. You can either put your questions in the chat, or once I can see your faces, I can call on you.
Or how do I
just push so I think either at the top or at the bottom. Does it say unshare screen or stop sharing?
Okay.
Okay, so does anybody have any questions? Comments? Ellen?
So not really a question, but more, I guess, a reflection, a resonance. I've had this very interesting experience in my own body. I've been a yoga practitioner for many, many years, but started lifting weights about 3 years ago. And the way that it's helped me develop my connection to Hara in a way that I never could before. And like literally this idea of practicing carrying load and how we can experiment with load and how that helps us to kind of, again, as you said, feel that relationship to gravity and a deep connection to center. For me, there's like something so unique about putting a bar on my back with a whole bunch of weight and having to try to squat down and get back up that has helped me to like feel that in a way I've never felt before. And then to even kind of extend that into sort of like emotional holding of load, and like, what is the load that I've practiced to carry, and what am I capable of holding? And like, what are loads that are too heavy for me at this moment? And like, that's where my training needs to continue, is when I bump up against something that I feel like the load is too heavy to carry, right? That's just something I'm kind of chewing on.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Ellen. And speaking of weight training, of course, there's different ways to use weights, right? And typically, the way that weights are presented as being useful is because it allows you to develop the power to overcome the weight. It's you against the weight, right? And that is definitely not what's happening, at least not what I'm hearing in your example, and certainly not what's happening in our Zen training, where you want the weight to defeat you in some sense. And yet you want the weight to defeat you such that it can defeat you by dropping you even deeper into your pelvic floor, even deeper into the belly, and feeling that rebound, right? But you absolutely, as you know, you can really hurt yourself if your core is not engaged, right? And I think that's where the exhalation really comes in. You always have that intensity at the core, which protects you, but doesn't just protect you, it transforms that defeat into a gain, such that you feel you can lift a 5-pound weight and really feel the weight of those 5 pounds. Instead of, I'm not interested in 5-pound weights. I only want 45-pound weights.
Roshi, I thought, well, let me say my observation first. I've had the experience of not letting grief run through me, and it getting backed up, like you were saying. And I've also had the experience of letting it run through me. But I found the points you were making at the end, if I understood it correctly, to be fascinating, that the grief can almost be like a clearing out process. Like it can clear the body out if you just let it. I wonder if you can comment on that more.
Yeah, absolutely. So catharsis, right? This really core organizing concern in the experience of theater, for example. Why do people voluntarily go to do something that's going to make them sad? Why do people go to watch sad movies or go to watch tragedies on the stage? Because they want to experience this letting go. They want to experience this dropping, this clearing. It's often called catharsis, right? This emptying out. We talk an awful lot in Zen about emptying out, not just Zen, but Buddhism and Taoism. An awful lot about realizing the nothingness. It's an emptying out. And interestingly, the term catharsis has a medical correlative, which is a cathartic, right? Which traditionally, grains, part of the gravis family, were used as cathartics. You would ingest it to cleanse your intestines of a poison. So it was a healing agent. I think grief, I think we know this. People who are in theater know this, in the arts. Grief is a cleansing, it's a healing agent, but it has to be encountered in the right kind of space. That's one response to your comment.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. If not, this was really an interesting talk. Thank you for sharing with us, Ashton, Roshi. I really appreciate you coming to the virtual dojo, being with all of us, sharing this wisdom. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your attention.